Thank you. Saud asked me to talk about this. I'll talk some about our work. I don't know a lot about terrorism. I've read some. I know even less about Islam. I've been learning and taking notes through the day. I would have had a different presentation had I done the presentation after the conference, but I'll do the best I can, telling you some about what we do and our perspective, and leave it up to those of you who know more about the specific phenomenology to determine the degree to which some of what I say might be applicable. I think the reason why people make the connection between cults and terrorism is they both involve conversion. People change in a dramatic way. In both, we witness normal, average-seeming people turn into zealous advocates. And maybe the study of cult conversions may help us better understand the terrorism phenomenon. And the treatment of cultists, helping families, preventing cult joining, may also have some applicability. That is not an esoteric kind of thing. We're basically applying standard psychological techniques to a special area. And there may be some lessons there. And I've already said I don't claim an expertise. There are many definitions of a cult. One by Professor Benzablocki of Rutgers stresses three components: that there's an ideology, charismatic relationships, and high levels of commitment, a lot of demand. So you have a leader-centered group with a belief system and demands. Such groups are not necessarily harmful or destructive, but they're at risk of becoming so if the leader uses his influence in order really to advance his agenda rather than the ostensible agenda of the group, which usually would be something idealistic and noble. And in order to get people to comply, there's a whole range of social psychological influence techniques that we observe in a very dense way, so to speak, in cults. And also, this notion of cultism is a continuum. You know, some groups have a very high level of control and influence and can damage people quite a bit. Others less so. And then you can grade off into an area where you just have kind of odd groups that might be strange, but they're not necessarily highly manipulative or destructive. Most cults are religious, but not all, as Steve mentioned. We've got decent prevalence data based on some studies. Zimbardo did a survey of young people in San Francisco, a random survey. Ed Loddick surveyed about 1,000. Family physicians in Pennsylvania. The Catalan government did an epidemiological survey in Spain. And we were able to piggyback onto a national telephone survey one year out of the University of Michigan. And more or less about 1% of the population seems to have had some kind of involvement in a cultic group. That's over a lifetime. That's not 1% at any given time. Based on other research, I roughly extrapolate that maybe in the United States we might have 100,000 people going in and out of cultic groups every year, and that's a range of cultic groups from extremely manipulative to relatively mild. And that statistics tells me that the Pakistani community, which I learned just in Connecticut, is 20,000 people. And if, as some of the young people talked about, you have youngsters who, because of the conflict they're feeling with discrimination and so on, are trying to distance themselves from their Muslim heritage, you may actually see more of your young people joining just the ordinary cults that we see and work with every day than it would be joining terrorist organizations. And also, I can understand why you're concerned about the would-be bomber in Times Square, but that's really one person, and the violence rate may not be any higher than the base rate. I mean, with cult population, people forget that, I mean, some pretty horrible things have occurred. I mean, Jonestown resulted in almost 1,000 people being killed or murdered. We had the Solar Temple murders, the Heaven's Gate suicides. Aum Shinrikyo is probably the largest weapon of mass destruction attack. They used sarin gas in the Tokyo subway, killed 12 people, injured 5,000. They could have killed many more had the trains come at a different time and if they had changed a few things. The Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh group in Antelope, Oregon, also used the biochemical weapon, salmonella virus. They sickened several hundred people in an attempt to control the election of that town. In a survey I did of our news summary paper, the Cult Observer, which went from 1984 to 2001, of 3,680 articles, 125 news articles on 35 groups involved murder, and 190 news articles involving 57 groups involved child abuse. So there is a significant amount of violence going on in the cult world, and you know, the terrorism violence. 10 minutes. Thank you. The terrorism violence, probably numerically, is, other than major attacks, isn't that great in terms of just numbers. It's the impact that's greatest. Okay. And the terror violence, what I was getting at, the terror violence fits into the media narrative. And other people have talked about that as an issue that you have to deal with. Now, some people ask, you know, what's the difference between religion and a cult? And, you know, there's a lot you can say about it. In summary, religions have lasted because they do meet needs of their members to some extent. I mean, they're far from perfect organizations, but they do provide something that's useful. Cultic groups, at least those on the continuum where people like Steve and I get involved, will tend to use these normal human needs in order to manipulate the members to meet the needs of leadership. The member serves the group rather than the group serving the member, which is usually the case, more or less, with mainstream religions. Religions also tend to help people adapt socially. Cultic groups tend to isolate members psychologically, if not physically. Naturally, when the isolation is physical, the risks increase because there's even less information coming into and out of the group. I've written a little bit about the pathway to violence in cultic groups, and perhaps this might have some relevance here. You start off with the social context. You know, you've got a society, and certain things may be common at a particular point in time. For example, in the late 60s, early 70s, we had what one theologian called the turning east of American youth who had been smoking pot and dropping LSD, and they discovered Eastern mysticism. And there was a great deal of interest, and many of them followed various Indian gurus. We also had the Jesus Revolution. Within this cultural milieu, you had some groups, many were not cultic or were not destructively cultic, but you did have some that were bona fide cults, and they were sort of like traps that people got stuck into. And this creates an environment. And I think, as others have discussed, this whole notion of alienation and so on in Pakistan and other areas creates a social environment that, in a sense, increases the receptivity of young people for certain outcomes. Now, the other factor, besides the social context, is a notion of what seekerhood. Much of that is just normal adolescents trying to grow up and find an identity and establish some sense of independence and self-confidence and so on. A seeker, you could say, is someone who isn't happy with what he has, so he's looking for something else. And the seekerhood is in a marketplace, particularly in pluralistic cultures like this, a marketplace of ideology, belief systems, and so on. And the social context may determine the probability of meeting up with certain